Chapter 6. A Surprising Find. "Mind you, I do not approve of this girl detective business," Mr. Crute said. But a slight smile played around his mouth. "Find Manda, and I may change the mind over. Tell me what you do when you work." Nancy and her friends were relieved and happy about the change in Mr. Crute's manner. "If you feel well enough to go outside, I'll be glad to give you a lesson," said Nancy. Manda's father arose from the chair. He said that some exercise would help to ease the stiffness in his strained muscles. Nancy started to go to her car for a flashlight. "No need to do that," said Mr. Crute. "I'll get a lantern." From underneath the closed-in sink, he brought out a kerosene lantern, lighted it, and he and the girls went outside. "Mama, you come too," said the farmer. "You should learn how the detectives make." Bess and George were a little puzzled as to what Nancy was going to show Mr. Crute, until she announced her plan of action. Mr. Crute was to take the girls on a tour of the barn and other buildings. During the trip, they would look for clues which might reveal where Manda possibly had gone. First, he showed them the spotless dairy. The girls were amazed to see that many of the stalls were empty. Mrs. Crute explained that Papa had given most of his cows to their sons. "We do not need so much milk, butter, and cheese now," she said a little wistfully. Nancy took the light and covered every inch of the floor, searching for a clue. Manda had dropped nothing there. Next, they went into the hay barn. As before, Nancy walked back and forth with the lantern, looking at every inch of the main floor. There was nothing on the immaculately clean boards. "How do you manage to keep the barn so tidy?" Bess asked Mrs. Crute. The woman smiled. "We are house Amish, and we hold our religious services in the barn when there are too many people for the house." Mrs. Crute chuckled. "People say that our barns are cleaner than our homes." "I'd like to climb to the loft," said Nancy. "Once when I was a little girl and got hurt on a farm we were visiting, I went to the hay mow to have a good cry all by myself. Maybe Manda did the same thing." "Go ahead," said Mr. Crute. "There's the ladder." Nancy scrambled up the rungs and disappeared in the hay. A moment later, she called out excitedly, "I found something!" Climbing down quickly, she held up a piece of paper. To the complete astonishment of Bess and George, they saw the printed words, "Witch Tree." "Do you know anything about this?" Nancy asked Mr. and Mrs. Crute, watching their expressions intently as they read the strange words. The couple shook their heads, and the farmer asked Nancy if she thought the paper had been dropped by Manda. "Possibly," Nancy replied, "but it might have been dropped here by the furniture thief." "What do you mean?" Mr. Crute wanted to know. Nancy reminded him of the hex sign with the strange wording under it, which she had found at the Follett mansion. "That's what really brought me up here," she said. "And you do not know what witch tree may mean?" The Crutes insisted that they had no idea what it could possibly mean, and were sure that Manda had not either. "Unless," said Mrs. Crute, "our daughter learned about it while she was working in Lancaster." Mr. Crute shrugged. It was all a mystery to him. The group inspected the rest of the buildings, but found nothing which might give a clue to Manda's whereabouts. The searchers returned to the house, sleepy and ready to retire. The girls were given 2 rooms, which were as plain as those on the first floor of the house. Each contained a rope double bed, 2 small wooden chairs, a small chest, and a curtained-off partition where clothes might be hung. But one thing was very noticeable in the candlelight. Each piece of furniture was gaily painted with a design of doves and flowers. The beds were covered with patchwork quilts made of pieces of vivid red, green, purple, yellow, and black material. "I just love it!" exclaimed Bess. Nancy slept alone and did not waken from the moment she got into bed until a crowing rooster roused her the next morning. Her mind refreshed. Nancy began to think at once about the two puzzling mysteries which she hoped to solve. The piece of paper she had found in the Croots' hayloft with the words witch tree on it puzzled her. What was the answer? Manda? Holt? Had the two met? The first thing Nancy did upon entering the kitchen was to ask Mr. and Mrs. Croots if they had ever heard of a Roger Holt. At once, the farmer said he had known one several years before. "The fellow lived in Lancaster. When he was just a kid, I caught him in my barn stealing tools. Do you suppose this is the same man?" Nancy said it no doubt was, because she had learned from the police that Roger Holt had once lived in Lancaster, and also that he had been imprisoned in New York as a thief. "I strongly suspect that he's the one who stole the valuable antique furniture in our town and accidentally dropped the paper with the symbol on it. I believe he came back there looking for the paper, but I found it first. Holt knows I'm searching for him and has tried to scare me off the case." Bess declared that probably it was Holt and not Manda who had left the witch tree paper in the hayloft. "He's still trying to hex you, Nancy," she said worriedly. Mr. Croots looked at the girl disapprovingly. "We Amish do not believe in hexing," he said. "There are some non-Amish people in the back country who practice witchcraft." "They do not all live in the back country, Papa," his wife spoke up quickly. "I was talking to Mrs. Deister at market. She told me about some people in town who think there are certain persons, especially women and girls, who practice witchcraft in secret. If these people hear that someone is a witch, they may be frightened into doing her bodily harm." Nancy smiled. "Don't worry. My friends and I don't believe in such things," she said, looking straight at Bess. "Roger Holt can try hexing me all he pleases. It won't keep me from trying to locate him and the stolen furniture." After breakfast, the three girls helped Mrs. Croots clean up the kitchen, then said they must be going. Nancy told the woman that she would combine trying to find Manda with her search for the furniture thief. The girls went upstairs, straightened their rooms, and packed their suitcases. When they appeared in the kitchen, ready to leave, Mrs. Croots was amazed. "You are taking everything with you?" she asked. "Could you not stay by us while you are solving your mystery?" "Oh, we don't want to wear out our welcome," said Nancy, smiling. Mrs. Croots put her hands on her hips. "Such an idea," she said. Then she smiled. "If you come back here each evening for supper, I can hear how you make out about my daughter." "Well, under those conditions, we'll accept your invitation," said Nancy. Bess giggled. "But if I eat as much supper every night as I did last evening, my family won't recognize me when I return home," she said. Mrs. Croots promised to serve a light supper that day. Then she proceeded to name a new menu containing 12 different kinds of food. The girls laughingly commented that they had better start sleuthing and work up good appetites. "What's our first stop?" George asked, as they started off in the convertible. "Lancaster," Nancy answered. "I feel so bad about Manda that I'd like to try finding her before we do anything else." "Me too," said Bess, and George nodded. In the city, the girls consulted a telephone directory and made a list of all the bakeries in town. Then they went from one to another, asking if Manda Croots were there or had ever worked at the shop. All replies were negative until they reached the Stum Bakery. There, the owner said that Manda had worked at the place until a couple of days ago. "We're very eager to find her," said Nancy. "Have you any idea where she might be?" "No, I haven't," the woman replied, "unless she went to work for those people that were in here." "Who are they?" Nancy asked quickly. "I think they're out-of-town Amish," Mrs. Stum answered. "At least I had never seen them before. From what I heard of the conversation, I gathered that they were just moving here and looking for an Amish girl to help with housework." Nancy asked the bakery clerk if she had ever heard Manda mention a witch tree. The woman shook her head. Nancy thanked her for the information she had given, bought a bag of fastnachts, and joined her friends. Curious, Bess asked, "What did you buy?" And at the same time, George said, "Did you find out anything about Manda?" Nancy grinned, opened the bag, and said, "Bess, if you can eat again after that huge breakfast you had, help yourself to a donut." To George, she replied, "I picked up a possible clue to where Manda went. She may be working for an Amish couple who have just moved into this area." "That should make it easy," said George. Referring once more to a classified telephone book, Nancy copied the names of real estate agents in town. This time, the girls divided the work of calling on them, and half an hour later met at the car. None of them had found a single clue to the wanted couple. "There's just one chance," said Nancy. "One of the men told me that old farms sometimes change hands in a direct sale. We'll keep asking. Now let's go to Mr. Zinn's." For a change, George drove, and Nancy gave directions to Alpha Zinn's home. Fortunately, they found it without any trouble. The place looked a great deal like the Kreutz's farm, only the buildings were smaller. "I suggest," said Nancy, "that we just pretend to be buying antiques." "Okay," replied George. "If we find out he has the furniture from River Heights, that mystery will be solved promptly." "And if we don't," added Nancy, "which I don't think we will, then our case is just beginning." Alpha Zinn's appearance bore out his cousin's remark about his great love of eating. But the roly-poly, smiling relative of Mrs. Tenney did not look like a man who was not to be trusted. Nevertheless, Nancy was on her guard. "I see you have an out-of-state license," the man remarked as the girls walked into a small building marked office. "You are interested in antiques?" Nancy replied that they would like to see what he had. When Mr. Zinn asked if they wanted to see anything in particular, Nancy told him that they would like to look around. The dealer led the way to a large barn, where the girls stared in amazement at the quantity of furniture on display. Not only was the main floor filled, but 2 haylofts had been completely cleaned out and were stacked with furniture. Nancy whispered to George and Bess to hold the man's attention while she made a tour by herself. In her purse, she had a list and description of pieces taken from the Follett homestead. Mrs. Tenney had given it to her just before Nancy left River Heights, together with a sketch of the George Washington tables. Nancy's plan worked admirably. Soon she found herself a good distance from the other 3. Taking Mrs. Tenney's list from her handbag, she began a systematic hunt for the stolen antiques. Most of the furniture on the list was of dark wood, while Mr. Zinn's pieces were of pine or maple. In a corner, however, Nancy saw a small cherry table. Instantly, her heart began to beat a little faster. Looking at the sketch in her hand, she compared it with the table. It matched perfectly. End of chapter 6.